Bonsoir à tous et bienvenue.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm going to start by recognizing that we are united here today on the traditional territories, lands of the Algonquin Nation.
Recognizing that we are sitting in the traditional lands of the Algonquin, and why in a meeting like today, two rivers and centuries of a people taking care of the land, coming here to trade, to learn, to negotiate, to celebrate. And we are going to be talking about how the connections between environment, the land, the people, the traditions make a difference in a moment of global change. And I don't think it's a better way to do it than honoring and recognizing the people that have kept this land for us to enjoy today. Santiago.
My name is Santiago Alba Corral, and I'm the Director of Agriculture and Environment of IDRC.
Contributor of the Government of Canada's international development efforts. We try to be responsible of engaging with researchers in the Global South, cross sectors, finding innovations, new thinkers, and creative minds together.
Our work is to resolve critical problems that in the Global South.
Work is the critical imperative to accelerate effective climate adaptation, to improve food security, and to do so in a way that is representative, equitable, inclusive, and engaging with the most vulnerable people and their voices. We recognize that many groups, women and girls, indigenous peoples, suffer actually in a way disproportionately from climate stress, food insecurity, and all the related challenges. But we also recognize that they are the agents of change, that they are the responsible of the development, and that they are already responding to the major crisis that we are facing. This brings difficult questions. How are social and gender roles challenged in an area of global change? How do unequal power relations influence resilience? Who negotiates these community roles, and who is responsible? Can a gender-focused approach really change the power structures? Today's panel will explore the intersection of power structures with efforts to foster greater autonomy among vulnerable groups. We will briefly discuss the manifestations of structural power, the issues of decision-making, and the access to resources when facing the local impact of a global trend. The panel will also share some of their examples, some of the things that we know that they are working, and how they actually have engaged with the groups of women and girls in the developing countries. We have researchers, we have practitioners, we have specialists. All of them have actually been working with IDRC in different initiatives. And I will actually go through some of these initiatives, not only to promote the work that IDRC does, but also to prove how difficult is what we are facing when we need to bring different IDRC teams and many of our partners and research funds together to look for solutions for the same problem. Three of them have been working in the climate change program that we call CARIA, the Collaborative Adaptation Research Initiative in Africa and Asia. It was one of the largest transdisciplinary and cross-regional research programs implemented by a consortia across Africa and Asia. Two of them have been working with adaptation at scale in semi-arid regions, a project in the Himalayan adaptation, water resilient research. We also have a panelist that is actually working with a current project in Kenya with our agriculture and food security program. Our panelists are going to be sharing their thoughts and experience on issues of decision-making, access to resources, power relations, and the local impact of this change. So I'm not going to go through the bios because they will take us the whole hour, as you can imagine, but let me go, and I think we are in the right positions. We have Nitya Rao, who is a professor of gender development at the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom. Welcome, Nitya. Daniel, can I say Daniel? That sounds much Spanish. Daniel Mochain is a senior advisor for resilience and climate change adaptation at Oxfam, UK, coming from the United Kingdom. We have Amina Maharjan, that works in Nepal for the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development as a livelihoods specialist for migration. And we have, directly from Kenya, Maureen Miruka, is the Director of Agriculture and Market Systems for CARE US, based in Nairobi. That's enough for today, at least from this page of today's. And let me go back directly to the question, how this is going to work. We are going to have close to 45 minutes of questions, and then we are going to want the panel to all of you to ask questions, to engage in the discussion, and to collaborate. We have two objectives. One of them is to figure out what are the major challenges that women and girls and vulnerable communities are facing, but we also want to know what is working. So we hope that we all have time to express what do you know that is the major challenges, but what do you know that is working. And we will try to be on time. We will be on time. So I'm going to start with Nidya. Exactly that's the question. How does structural power unfold? What are how the gender roles really are distributed in this specific moment of history of global changes? And these cultural and norms, social responsibilities, who negotiates what, with what authority in a global context that is local?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a good starting point, because I think by its very nature, when we talk about gender relations, these are location specific. These are contextually embedded. So there's no universal gender relations, but gender relations are framed or negotiated in particular contexts. But also, I think one of the basic things that we say about gender relations is that these are power relations. And these are not just individual power relations between individuals, but they go across institutions. So from the family as a very basic institution, or the household, to community levels, to the markets and how markets function, and of course to state and state policy. And each of these institutions has their own norms, their own values, their own what they see as appropriate of who should be doing what, and so on. And I'll give some examples of that. And these interact with each other. So often we end up thinking that, okay, if we want women's empowerment or gender equality, let's focus at the household level. Let's change behavior of men and women within households. And this is important. It's no doubt important. But actually, it's not going to lead to lasting change unless we also address unequal power relations at different sites. So to take a very simple example, of workplace, often, women are educated, skilled. I come from India, where there's a huge now female unemployment problem, and the issue is that women say that we are highly educated, but in the labor market, there are wage gaps. So women earn about, 60% or 70% of what men earn. So if there's a decision to be made, then it would be man who goes to work and the woman who stays at home. So these are structural disadvantages. And these are the way in which structural power works, often invisible, often very overt and under the surface. So from our own work, I would like to give an example. With the Carrier Consortium, as Ricardo just said, we were working in semi-arid East Africa, in Kenya and Ethiopia, with pastoralist groups there. And for the last 10-15 years, they have been encountering continuous drought. And the drought is getting more and more intensive. The rainfall is getting less and less. Of course, the implication for pastoralists has been both a scarcity of pasture and a scarcity of water. Once we start looking at the multiple, put this into a context of livelihoods and people's lives at a household level, you find that how these institutions interface with each other in terms of divisions of roles and responsibilities, in terms of access to resources and assets, and also decision-making. And just very quickly from this example, so with water, scarcity of water, for instance, there's a competition for water for livestock, for their livelihood, because they are pastoral groups, and for domestic purposes, let's say. Earlier, the livestock would go out. There were various water pans which would fill up every year with the rains, and now those water pans are dry. So the two choices are either the pastoralists, they give water, they water their cattle in the village itself, in which case they're using the same water points that women would be using to collect domestic water. So women have to wait for a long time while the livestock finish drinking and then only have water. The other option is that they take their livestock far away. The implication then of this is that if the livestock go far away, the women, while the men, livestock is seen as a male asset, if you like, but the women have some control over the milk. And they would go to wherever the pastoralists, their husbands were, milk the animals, come back and sell it in the market, and this was a source of daily income. So if the livestock is far away, then they also lose access to that source of income. So you're stuck in a, so this is sort of labor divisions are kind of changing because of these getting intensified or entrenched in some ways, and disadvantage is multiplying because of climatic factors and sort of livelihood patterns at the household level. It gets further intensified, as I just said earlier, that even in northern Kenya, amongst the pastoralist groups, education is very low for both men and women. So if you were to get other jobs, or look for other jobs to earn while your livestock is dead or far away, then women don't get that kind of jobs. They have to go because the labor markets are very discriminatory, and also they are gender segregated. So however much we may talk about gender equality, only certain kinds of jobs will be available to women in the labor market. So in our northern Kenya example, we found that it was like either cleaning and domestic work, laundry work, petty trade, that kind of stuff, or a more risky venture, which is actually some kind of part-time or casual sexual services. There's been also a lot of construction and so on going on in that area, and a lot of labor movements from outside as well. It's not the best option for women, but then if with their men away, if they have to feed their children, then these are the options that the labor market offers. So that's, again, how do we confront this structural disadvantage? Make more decent work, have regulations which sort of provide or ensure that work is protected, work is decent, and so on. And here comes the final level, which is the state, that the state also is very blind to these kind of power inequalities. So there's very little provision, for instance, of healthcare, protective healthcare services. So if we know that in crisis or in context of crisis or drought, if women are engaging in risky ventures, there should be availability of sexual and reproductive health services, information on protection, some kind of regulation, but none of this actually exists. There's no childcare services, so it has also effects on food security and nutrition, because if the women are away working and the men are somewhere away, actually the small kids are basically left on their own to manage without food, without nutrition. So I think these are kinds of the interlinkages that we find in terms. How am I doing for time? Okay, in terms of intersecting across institutions, which is very important. I just wanted to very quickly say that within CARIA, I was also involved with a meta-synthesis, a cross-CARIA synthesis, looking at women's agency and gender relations in the context of climate stress and environmental stress. And we used a methodology called qualitative comparative analysis, QCA. From across the 4 consortia, we had sort of 25 cases, which we then ran through this software to find out what are the factors which are leading to sort of either promoting, encouraging women's agency or depressing it. And very interestingly enough, the key one was actually around social institutions. So it was about sort of the failure of what we call a social capital within development, or sort of social support, people supporting each other in such contexts of stress, of environmental stress. And at the same time, that state interventions or state social support was not really working in the ways in which it should be working to reverse or to support women in meeting, and men in fact, in meeting some of these disadvantages. The final thing I wanted to say is that when you talk about gender, I've been speaking about women so far, but actually one of the most vulnerable perhaps groups that we found in northern Kenya when we sort of spoke to different people was young men. Because the older men are well established with livestock, they have big herds. And with the drought, the herds have been dying and the young men are not able to access herds. So neither do they have education, nor do they have herds, nor can they get jobs. So they're not able to provide, they're not able to marry. So this has become a big issue there actually, because men need to provide bride price in order to get married. And they have no source of income to be able to actually provide bride price. So you're reaching a situation of sort of social crisis, in fact, or social breakdown, where, particularly for young men, because young women are joining up with their mothers and their aunts and so on and having their households. Young men basically can't really join up with their fathers because they want to be independent, but then they are left nowhere. And this is one of the aspects, actually, which has been fueling violent conflict in northern Kenya. So this ethnic conflict, if you like, it's presented as ethnic conflict, but one of the drivers definitely is sort of a crisis for young men in a context where pastoralism, or they're not able to get and build herds, not able to get married, so they're just on the loose with drugs, and now they get arms very easily, and they're engaging in this kind of conflict. So when we're sort of thinking about structural power, I think from a gender perspective, we need to think about women, but we also need to think about the relationships with men that they have, and across generation, across age group.
Thank you, Nitya. Daniel, we have, Nitya has presented the scenario of how the power relations happen, but can you tell us how actually they influence resilience and the capacity of responding to crisis, and how communities negotiate or renegotiate roles and responsibilities in this specific moment that most of them are affected by the global change of climate change and others?
Okay, thanks, Santiago. Well, let me start with one example directly of a piece of work we have done, is still ongoing actually in Malawi. And there, the question has been, what does resilience mean in the context of the Malawian tea industry, which is one of the key industries for the country. And basically, we put together a consortium of private sector, civil society, people working in the areas where the tea industry is predominant in the south of the country, and to come up with the criteria of what makes the tea industry in Malawi resilient, or what sustainability means in that context. And the things that came out of this debate was very much around economic criteria. So money matters a lot, of course. You need to have a profit in order to keep the industry working. And then issues around, for example, the age of the tea bushes in the plantations, the type of infrastructure that is necessary to take the product out of the country to the port in Mozambique, the technology that is necessary to do so, and then climate risks from a point of view very much of how they affect the soil or the plants. So that was kind of the story about what sustainability and the tea industry in Malawi was. And we kind of felt, well, there's no story here told about people. How can people not be part of this industry if they are obviously at the core of that? They are working there, they're making a living out of that. So we kind of went back to the group and tried to create a different environment to create an opportunity where everybody felt they could contribute to this debate. And there, particularly with the platform, enabled the unskilled laborers, which were there before but still had not been able to speak or felt comfortable to speak, to tell their story. These are mostly a group of women, unskilled laborers, tea pluckers, basically. And they talked a lot about other issues, around sexual harassment in tea plantations, around the harsh treatment of laborers, which was felt by not only women but also men, actually. And even actually now, going back to Nitya's point, actually then men talking about this became even much more difficult. But anyway, so we've realized that half of the story is what we knew before, the whole economic, the whole risk, but this link to well-being and how that is so relevant for sustainability and for the industry's resilience was also so important. So we kind of felt that there was a reframing of what resilience means, and now we could feel, okay, it makes more sense. Now we know the whole story is being told. I feel resilience is something that traditionally has been very much about physical hazards, but little by little is becoming more shifting to resilience be about rights, about entitlement, about gender equality. But the discourse, while the discourse is there in academia and other sources, the action, the funding for this kind of work is lagging behind quite a bit. Just to give you a quick factoid, there's only 3% of climate overseas development assistance goes to or considers gender justice a top priority of their work. Only 3%. So little, even though gender justice is clearly, such an important part of resilience, of sustainable development, of adaptation to climate change, or effectively doing so. So the work is lagging behind on adaptation, on development, it remains quite technocratic, quite monodisciplinary, even though there's so much talk about interdisciplinary and all of that. It remains quite inflexible in some ways of what you can do. And this is a reflection, as going back to the point in the case in Malawi, of what knowledge is considered valuable, what knowledge is considered irrelevant. In this case, the first thing that I talk about in the Malawi case, and the second one, which is more on well-being, personal experience, and all that, that is still struggling to make it to the picture and say this also matters when it comes to effective adaptation or, let's say, sustainable development efforts.
Thank you, Dani. Following on that, we have in a scenario of climate change, food insecurity, conflict, instability. What happens when women challenge the social norms, the status quo, and the power relations?
Yes, Santiago. So today in the discussion, I'll be speaking mostly for the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. It's a region which faces some rapid changes, climate change and other socioeconomic changes. Very recently, just this Monday, we have also launched a report that assesses the changes that the Hindu Kush Himalayan region is facing. And the climate change has definitely come up as one of the most strongest challenges that this region faces. Now, you have on the one hand these huge challenges coming up, but the capacity of the population to cope with this challenge is very limited. And this is where the problems start. Now, Daniel, you mentioned about resilience, and many households in the region now use labor migration as one of the ways to cope or to adapt to these changes and challenges. So when I say labor migration, here the households remain back home, but one or two members go out. They are sent out to work and send money home. And what we found in our research is often the households send men, and mostly young men below 40 years of age. So these are the members who actually go out, and women and rest, children and older people are then back home. And it's not only in Himalayas. Actually, I was also part of the cross-consortia work, including in semi-arids and in deltas in South Asia, and we found everywhere it's same. It's the men, young men, who are migrating, and the households are left behind. Now, this is bringing, the whole gender in discourse, it's bringing one additional, if you may say, challenge. Now we have an increasing number of women-headed or women-only households where the men are not there. So on the one hand, we are talking about gendered roles, division of labor, roles, responsibilities, but now you are having households where, because of the absence of men, these roles are now vacant, and women are expected to take these up. One opportunity working in gender field is excellent, because earlier you had to push and pull about these different roles, and now suddenly you have these vacant roles and women are taking it up. So that has resulted in women's expanding their roles beyond the traditionally gender division and getting into more spaces, both at private as well as in public spheres. So you have more women participating in groups, in meetings, and so on. Now that's an advantage, leading to more empowerment of women, women having more decision-making power, more voices. But simultaneously, there is also a challenge. The challenge is because at the ground, these changes are happening. But then if you look into the institutions and structure, here then, as Nitya mentioned, it's at various levels, be it at household level, community level, or state level. Those have not been able to change, so that those structures, which are normally very rigid, has not been flexible enough to adjust with this changing ground realities, the changing gender landscape. And this is when then often you see conflict. Now what happens is women are expected to take, since I mentioned about climate change, for adaptation, they are supposed to take the whole responsibility for that. But then do they really have the capacity to do it? And without these changing structures, the power dynamics has remained the same, which then actually curtails the women's agency to adapt and to cope with these changes. So what we found, for instance, whenever we talk about migration is always put as a problem. It's never part of the solution. It's always put as a problem. And the discussion always ends up with, how do you stop migration? So it's not only a global north discussion, but also in global south. It's always like, how do you stop migration? Because it's bringing so many changes, and people are getting a bit insecure about all these changes that's happening, but then the structures are not able to adjust to that. And the tendency is, how do you maintain status quo? Because the change is always difficult. How do you maintain that status quo? Now, what is important to understand is this conflict is happening because the moment you talk about power and power dynamics, it's inevitable that conflict would come. Because with power comes conflict. That's the other part of the game. But what is inevitable is, for instance, this is a region facing really very high negative impacts of climate change. And when we did our survey in the 4 river basins, more than 85% said that they perceive change in temperature and in precipitation patterns. But then the next question that we asked was, so what is the impact it has in your agriculture, livestock, water, and forest sector? And what are you doing to reduce this negative impact of these changes? 85% perceived the changes, but then only 29% of the households reported that they are doing something to reduce the change. In livestock sector, it was even lesser, 15%. In forest, 7%. And some of these are not even coping. Like we had households who said that, yeah, agriculture is becoming very difficult. The uncertainties are increasing, so we are leaving the agriculture sector, which is really not adaptation or even coping. So this is what, because it's women, and you have put a lot of burden on the shoulders, but you don't have the support system to help her adapt to these changes or to take up these responsibilities. So what's happening is a lot of the households are failing to adapt to the changes that's happening. Let me stop here for now.
That's a perfect moment, I think, actually, because I want to hear from Maureen on your experience, and you have a lot of working on the ground. How can women challenge this structural power relations and social injustice in an effective way?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Santiago. And I think Amina has alluded to the fact that women, get together, organize themselves in collectives, and in most of the agricultural or any other programming that we do, we work with these women groups and collectives as the platforms for either empowerment or agency or capacity building. But women themselves, and speaking as a woman myself, need to recognize that agency building, skills building only takes you so far, as Amina has correctly recognized, that it's going to go further in addressing these structural and systemic issues. So we're looking at their own mobility, for instance, which really prevents women from engaging markets. We are looking at their political participation. We are looking at issues such as gender-based violence. So we are going to empower women, or women are going to be empower themselves to move into the next levels of solidarity, so that there is a lot of critical consciousness building and reflection amongst themselves on these structures, on the social norms, and take this to the next level. In CARE, we have a flagship called the Village Savings and Loans Associations, which have gone through so many years. It originated in Niger, in West Africa. In Niger, you find that the women's, now they're called Women on the Move. They have a French name, I don't speak French, that have gone all the way to the political system, that have been able to move from village savings and loans associations into programming platforms, into influencers of the political space. They are on the table, because I think you've heard that if women are not sitting at the table, then they're on the menu. But the other bit of this that is missing is that we also need to bring these conversations around engaging men and boys in this conversation on the critical reflection spaces, on the rigid and discriminatory social norms that that we have, because we cannot be targeting women only. It's like you're playing with one half of the team, and yet we should be playing together in the system. So engaging men and boys through gender dialogues that we have developed tools within care that we use. In our work with the Agriculture and Food Security team at IDRC in Kenya, we take men and women through reflection spaces, through gender dialogues, using specific tools where they reflect upon the social norms, say how they can be changed, why they were the way they were, and where we can move forward with those. And there is a myth that social change takes a long time, but with 1 year of implementing such a program, we have seen significant changes in men. Workload sharing, caregiving, and what we hope to see at the end of 3 years is more systemic changes, such as men allocating the productive pieces of land to their wives and spouses, and really considering women as partners, and that women's empowerment is not a threat to their masculinity, rather it is, for the benefit of the household. If I have a minute, a few seconds, I will also say there's another segment of these structures of women who, especially the older generations, like my mother, grandmother age, that are the caretakers, the gatekeepers of patriarchy. So in targeting men, we also need to target the segment of women that actually work together with men or with traditional structures and systems to perpetuate these discriminatory norms. I mean, I come from Kenya, where female genital mutilation is, really practiced. There is not a single man that has ever taken a razor blade to circumcise a woman, It's the women that do it. They go through it. It's a terrible experience, but they still want their daughters and grandchildren to go through it. And all of these, finally, you find that they have links towards gender-based violence. They affect agricultural production systems. So we do need to be looking at these traditional structures, traditional leaders, religious leaders, and these segments of the population that can influence changing of those deeply entrenched social norms.
Thank you. And actually, I want to go to Daniel, to challenge you a little bit. Is it really possible to shift these rooted systems, to shift the dynamics? And if it's possible, what does success look like?
I think I want to come to a point that you were saying, Maureen, about kind of looking at these figures that normally are not the usual. You would expect, okay, the prejudice might come from here, but not from here, or the entrenched social norm or whatever. And I think, in trying to answer your question, it's very important to also look at ourselves and look at how we are, or whether we are contributing to disentangling or, changing the way that the power structures are working for that change that we're trying to do. And before I refer to that, very little funding going, for example, to gender justice when it comes within climate development efforts, and like that you can find many examples everywhere. So let's look at our institutions. Let's look at ourselves. Are we telling the stories that need to be told? Are we kind of pointing fingers at ourselves and at the issues that are there that sometimes they're a little bit too difficult or politically not very wise to point at, but are we not pointing at that? Shouldn't we be pointing at that? What are the things that we are doing with our work, with our research is new? What is innovative? Are we looking at the same problem once and once again with a kind of similar solution? So you've been talking also about transformation. What are we really pushing that enough? And also, are we listening? Are we listening to these other stories that are maybe already out there? Go back to my point about Malawi, but we're just not listening to them or not creating an opportunity for them to be heard. So I'd throw it back at us for a little bit before just immediately going and say social norms have to change somewhere very far. And also, being here in the university, I think it's very important to think about the impact that we would like our research to have. When do you, as a researcher, start thinking about that? Is it at the very end when the article is coming out and you say, okay, where do I publish it? Or is it really from the beginning? Who do you do the research with? And in that spirit, because with the CARIA programs, we very much focus on research, what we call research into use, or research that has an impact. We really embedded that into the programs, the IDRC funded programs of CARIA. And I wanted to, show you in 2 examples how we try to push ourselves in this project to do things a little bit differently in order to spark these new conversations. And one was around working with a theater, forum theater, or it's called sometimes theater of the oppressed, where you basically portray a reality on stage, and then you give the audience, like yourselves now, the opportunity, when we reenact it, to come on stage, change the story that we're telling here, and see what happens. And see, give you the opportunity in a bit of a safe space, a safe space, but very real in a way because of the issues that were being presented. We did such an exercise or such an activity in a Cape Town in South Africa, a township near Cape Town, and we presented a play where suddenly actually a new technology, a roof, is literally thrown in every house, every roof of every house, and then there was a discussion in the group, in the audience, whether that was, well, at least it's a new roof, it'll help us, or whether there should be pushing back, even, for when the solution could be helpful, because it's promoting this idea that the solutions come from outside, they don't come from ourselves. So that kind of discussion is so important to have. The second example I wanted to share is in Botswana. We did a lot of work there as well. We continue doing it. And we came with the idea, with our research impact, that we wanted to inform and influence the adaptation and development planning at the national level. We went to the government, we said this, and they came back to us and said, don't worry about it, thank you, but no thank you. We already do grassroots adaptation planning, so goodbye. But we thought, okay, what's happening here? Maybe there's a room for improvement. So we went back, we started working at the subnational level, or sub-district level even. We brought different levels of stakeholders together. We, for example, brought a group of Mopane. Mopane is a worm, and this group of women, mostly they were women, they make a living out of basically harvesting these Mopane worms and selling them in different forms. But they are they eat from the leaf from the Mopane tree, and that is very sensitive to drought. Anyway, to make a long story short, that was an opportunity. The government came, local level government, they heard the stories that the Mopane worm harvesters had to say. Basically, they understood better. This group kind of felt like the isolation, because they were unknown, really, to anyone above the local level of governance. They kind of started to feel that they were being heard, and they had a contribution to give. Likewise, the government officials felt like, okay, well, maybe there's something more around agency that we can do around here. It's not all about thinking of an emergency response and looking at these groups of people who are the most marginalized as someone who just gets aid every now and then, and we just keep repeating the cycle. So I'm not saying this one thing changed everything, or anything like that, because my colleagues have been talking about the challenges of that. But that you start that kind of conversation, and you start to get people to think a little bit differently. And I think that is so important when you're doing this kind of work that we are all doing here. So just actually, you talk about success, Santiago, and I think the success here is that the government, after seeing that, they actually said, we're getting some good ideas from this. So maybe you're right, you're onto something, we can take some of your ideas. They invited us actually then, or asked us to do the similar exercise nationwide in the 16 districts of Botswana, to basically train them in this kind of methodology, because it's really more participatory. They learn from that, they take that on board, and they can use it now to, they are using it. Actually, last week I was in Botswana in a different district, because they wanted still a little kind of support in doing yet their second exercise on these planning processes. And they have, for example, invited us to write we already did a chapter on the district development planning on climate change, to include these kind of considerations into their planning. So I guess I've run out of time.
You have a little bit of time.
Yeah? Okay, so another thing we do.
They are so
okay,
afraid because I told them to be on time, so don't worry, I didn't bring the stick.
Okay. No, well, just in a few seconds, but just to say that also there, one of the value that I think we got out of this, the government really got, because it's not for us to get the value, but really for them to find it useful, and for the people there in Botswana in this case, was that they said, okay, listen, we want to plan a new strategy on drought, because drought in Botswana is happening more regularly, more intense. So now it's almost like every year or so, every other year kind of event. So they've really come to the point and say, we need to change the way we are addressing this, which is just emergency response, it's not working. So the beauty of this was that the approach that we took under CARIA allowed an organization like mine, Oxfam, to work with universities across the African continent and Asia to work together. So the government of Botswana came to us and said, we want a mixed experience here from your practitioner side and from the academic side to really develop a framework for us on what it would be ideal how can we ideally address this challenge of drought being more recurrent? And there we managed to introduce principles of like gender equality, seeing groups of marginalized people who are presently marginalized, also likewise women to be much more part of the solution than just being aid recipients, basically. And that then we delivered that to the government, and the government is working with that to develop their own drought management strategy. We also recognize, we are going a little bit into this normative space of saying, okay, this is what we recommend you to do. And that's also where Oxfam kind of negotiates and says, let's go a little bit further. Our academic partner says, okay, we're going a little bit too far now. So, but we are in a space that is very much influencing a decision that is relevant for development. And I think that's the point, actually.
Thank you. Let's move from the plateau of the Kalahari to the Himalayas again. What are the barriers there to women's progress? And how actually are you addressing them with them? And I really want to know what are the voices that need to be present when addressing these barriers?
Thank you, Santiago. Barriers, I would say greatest barriers are probably at the first step, us. When I say us, all of us. I don't know how much capacity we actually have, or willingness or openness to try to understand and accept the changes that's happening. So I would say barrier myself first, because, all these changes are happening. It's quite complex thing. And somehow we have this tendency to jump to, very simple and linear narratives. And I now borrow your terminology of, not only being aid recipients, but more participatory and also listening to the voices. That's very important. Now let me give you an example. Again, on the CARIA, we had this excellent opportunity to do a research on linking migration and agriculture abandonment. Now, if you come to Nepal, in any of the national discourses, the poor performance of agriculture sector, the agricultural land abandonment is because of international migration of men. So you would hear this in the villages, you go to the groups, people will tell you the same story. Go to the national level conferences, you will hear the same story. And since by training I'm an agriculturist, I started my career as an agriculturist. I speak with my colleagues, they all like, we need to stop migration because that's the cause of, all this agriculture abandonment, the social disintegration of social systems, everything is to be blamed. So when we did this study to see the difference, because we don't even know how much of land is being abandoned. Nobody has a figure of that. So we thought, can you please have that figure? And then can we really look into what are the drivers for this agricultural land abandonment? And interestingly, our finding totally contradicts the general narrative, because international migration did not have any impact on agricultural land abandonment. It was indeed internal migration that had an impact. When men migrated, it was negative. So which means to say agriculture was intensively used. When women migrated, that's when abandonment happened. So when we found this result, the first thing we did is, before we share with our colleagues, let's first go back to the villages, to the study sites where we did this study, and then first get feedback from or in a sense, endorsement, validation from the people itself, if what we are finding is correct or not. So it was very interesting when we went there, discussed, and some of the notions that general public believed was also changed. Because we realized very quickly, it's not because of international migration that the agriculture sector is poorly performing. It's because women are taking the entire burden of agriculture. Now, this is something, again, is in discourse last 2-3 decades already, the feminization of agriculture sector. So what's happening, the factors why it's happening is, it's all on women, but then if you look into the services and the support system, it's simply not women friendly. So if you look into the agriculture extension system, it's totally male dominated. So extension workers are mostly men and male oriented. The hypothesis is the farmers are men, and the entire thing system is, oriented towards it. So the agriculture extension people cannot go to the village. You are expected that the people would come to you to get the knowledge, to get the technologies and so on. But women, time poverty, the gender norms, the stereotypes has a barrier in mobility of women. So how are they going to go and access this first? Second, you are talking about technology. So of course it's going to take you money to probably buy that technology and use it. But then you have no control, women have no control over resources. And if you want to have credit, access to finance without any control over resources, it's going to be extremely difficult. So you have all the burden, keep adding the burden, but then you have no support system for the women to take it. So that's why, agriculture sector is now getting, less and less preferred by the households, and people are leaving this sector and moving out. That has a consequence on the food security, definitely, at the national level, particularly. Now, Nepal is so dependent on the import of foods, and it's increasing year after year. But it's so important to understand these nuances, because if you are blaming everything on international migration, then the solution is let's stop migration. But now when you look into the clearer picture, now you understand that it's women's capacity that needs to be built in order to have a flourishing agriculture sector. And for that, it's not only looking into agriculture sector. Now you have to come to the basics of that power dynamics, because if you're talking about control over resources, then you are hitting the inheritance law, because inheritance by default is through sons. So, you are looking into very basic, and if you're talking about now women as leaders, as managers, so that mindset needs to be changed, because so far women are, heart of the home, and men are supposed to be the head of the home. But now the heart and head is all on women. So how do you, that change in mindset, how do you develop women as leaders? How do you teach your girls? How do you accept that? That's another big challenge. How do you accept, because now another story is if women take that challenge up, are doing it, then suddenly at the household level, you are not accepted anymore. Because how can you be so vocal? The women you are supposed to be meek and whatever the terminology. Shy. So
I'd actually take that question up to Maureen on how change can happen if it's community-led, if it's actually how the women, the gender focus or the gender transformative approaches actually can be the actor on the play to make this change. What are the elements that we need to have to really make a change that is community-led?
Thank you, Santiago and Amina. I think we've got to begin by realizing that once we have community-based approaches or rights-based approaches that place the power in the women's hands or in the communities themselves, that in itself is the beginning of that transformation. But if we're in the research and development sector, then we need to have the approaches that actually can address the several dimensions, because it's not just enhancing access to agricultural services or enhancing access to markets. Then you've got to think about the household nutrition, because all the food could be sold. Then you also have to look at the fact that women have to have that household influence to influence around agricultural assets and incomes, as well as those from the household. So how do you go about doing that? For the last so many years, CARE has been implementing a program, a multi-country program in Africa and in Asia that is called Pathways to Empowerment, that took the traditional farmer field and the farmer field school approach, which is really a learning by doing approach, but then sought to demonstrate what it means to put women at the center of such development approaches. So we called it the Farmer Field and Business School because it looks at the agriculture practices, it looks at linking women to markets, it looks at how women can get market literacy, it looks at how women can have this influence at the household, and how we can engage men in household nutrition decision making. So the approach in itself was targeted specifically at women, working with seed providers to pack seeds in packages that are manageable for women, that, just ensuring that the system is responsive to the needs of women. So the evidence showed that this approach does work in terms of moving the needle around gender transformative in agricultural production systems. But the actual tangible scientific evidence that tells us these are the pathways through the livelihoods outcomes or through the gender equality outcomes that actually give us these food and nutrition security outcomes, we still were lacking in that data. So we then again partnered with the Agriculture and Food Security unit at IDRC to implement this project in Kenya that gives us the evidence base that we need, because we are moving from theory to practice, but we need to continue to inform theory. We need to demonstrate that gender transformative approaches do work, and they do lead to food and nutrition security outcomes, as well as gender equality outcome and change that is actually sustainable. The other thing about all these approaches that we do in development, so I'm talking about the Farmer Field and Business School, we have the social analysis and action that gets us to reflect on the changes, ourselves, and we were doing this training for our project in Kenya just last week. The idea is that ourselves as change agents, we've also come up through some cultures. There is ways that we have been, brought up. There is our belief systems. There is our values. There is a way they mirror in the way that we work and in the way that we seek to make that change out in the field. So our work at CARE is very heavily focused on ensuring that we ourselves as change agents do actually appreciate what this change looks like, understand that contexts are different, because you've had Daniel, he said, working in all the countries, it's not the same. We have one approach, it's not a one-size-fits-all. So how do we, train ourselves that the context matters, and how do we continue to train the community change agents that I talked about before, the men, the women, the extension workers. When we do training for the Farmer Field and Business School, we ensure that all the partners and ourselves at CARE are in one room so that the message is not diluted. We train community-based extension agents. We put quotas for women because extension systems, as she correctly said, are so male-dominated and tailored towards men. So we ensure that when we have community-based extension workers who are incentivized by the community-based systems themselves, they are incentivized by farmers. For the village savings and loans associations, we have the village agent model, where it is the village savings and loans associations themselves that pay the trainers, because we can never quite be able to bridge the extension gap that we have in governments. I mean, it's been almost 30 years, or 20, since the Kenyan government, for instance, employed recent agricultural graduates into the system. So working on these systems at community level and building those capacities for the changes that remain within the community, ensuring that these approaches and tools are tailored towards the needs of women, towards addressing structural issues and systemic issues. It's only then that we are going to be able to move that needle. So thankfully, we do have the funding to continue to build this evidence base as we go along and feeding back into research and development.
Thank you, Lydia. So where do we go from here? And we have to boost resilience. We need to integrate climate adaptation in our planning, in our mindset. What kind of approaches need to be present when we develop new initiatives?
First, just to pick up from what the other speakers have said, I think we know that life is complex. All our lives are very complex. And I think that's the same for communities with whom we work. We tend to simplify sometimes and come up with sort of one solution, whether it's microfinance, whether it's education for girls or whatever. There becomes one sort of silver bullet which is often used. And I think what this discussion actually and the examples do show is that the contexts are different, the people are different, the resources that they have are different, their cultures are different, and therefore, obviously solutions need to respond to that. We can't have the same solution and try it out in different locations. And I think this is something which has actually really come out very strongly from career research, which we've done on gender and the meta-synthesis as well, something which in technical language is called sort of complex causality. But it's really that, there's no straight causal relationship between any of these factors, whether it's climate, whether it is development, whether it is state failings, whether it's illiteracy. But actually there's a complex combination of factors that's leading to this. So I think, to invert that, and then how do we move forward? I think one thing which others have said that we have to sort of start with an open mind, not with predetermined solutions, listen to people, see what they have to say, and actually that might then throw up, because there are solutions out there, people are managing in different ways. So it might just throw up sort of multiple entry points through which we can enter. We might enter through the state, we might enter through the community, but there could be different ways of entering to find context-based solutions. So from our own work with Career, just a couple of examples, very quick ones, and one is when we were working at the community level with the pastoral communities. There, the decision-making pattern is quite sort of gerontocratic. I mean, it's old men, basically, who are the traditional leaders, who make the decisions about pasture, about water distribution, and so on. And clearly, from what I said earlier, this was creating problems. So what we did is, we did something called a participatory scenario analysis. We said, okay, you're confronted with this problem of pasture and water scarcity, but we brought groups of sort of men and women, but older men, older women, younger women. They first spoke separately with each other in groups, and then we brought them together to speak to each other. And it was very interesting, just having a platform where actually older men were also forced to listen, not just to women, but also to younger men, and how they resented the control of the older men. It was quite interesting, and it also sort of threw up different scenarios in terms of how they might address the problem of pasture scarcity and water scarcity, and then engaging into a debate or a discussion with that to slightly open up. Otherwise they were thinking that, no, we have to do zoning or we have to do land regulation, and this just kind of opened up the possibilities that might be there. What it did lead to is actually some kind of peer-to-peer learning activity, which Oxfam supported, in terms of talking to these people, recording that, and producing a short 10-minute video of people saying what are the kinds of options they wanted to use. And then this was then shown with other groups, and actually to help sort of in a peer-to-peer learning. And we hope also that with some additional funds now that they are going to carry it forward with more communities. Because of course, limitations of researchers in a research project is that the problem is huge. The populations are huge. You only end up working with a small cluster of people directly, face to face. But how do we kind of scale up some of this? I think that was very interesting, just at a community scale. The other thing, of course, is, and I think this is a good way of actually dealing with trade-offs, because there are winners and losers. And I think this is the second point, really, in terms of moving ahead. Where do we go from here? In terms of how do we frame the discourse, or how do we frame the solutions? Because clearly you can't make everybody happy. We have to take at some point a position, and I think this is where it comes to the crunch. When we are addressing power relations by its very nature, we are taking some stand. We can't be a bystander or a sort of mid-stander. And I think that's the crunch. That's where the point comes. But I think doing it in a more participatory way, that clearly, the older men, rather than saying, no, we are against you and we want to give the power to the younger men, or the younger women, I think doing it in a more collective fashion was one way of addressing that these are the real challenges, these are the choices, and how do we take a decision which is more transparent, at least, if nothing else. So I think dealing with trade-offs, that was very important. And I think the third thing which I would say is that, which we have done, I think, Not so much as a follow-up of the carrier, but we're trying to do it. We had a meeting when we were doing our dissemination with the Council of Governors, which is, again, very hierarchical, but it is a federal council. It sits there. There's a sort of a team there working with arid and semi-arid regions, and they kind of have one sort of gender. You know, everybody now has to have gender within their the strategy. They don't really know what it means. And then they were kind of laughing and saying to us when they introduced themselves that, yes, gender is a program and youth is a program. And I just asked the question that, you know, when you say gender, when you say youth, do you realize that youth is also women? I mean, youth is also sort of not just young men, but also young women. And same with gender, you know, everybody, all of us have a gender in this room, and they were kind of sniggering a little bit. But I think actually they really picked up on that point, that it was a different way of thinking, and they felt very comfortable when you said that you could also include some interventions for young men in sort of the gender category, and you didn't only have to be targeting women all the time. So I think there's different ways of dealing and breaking through these. And the final thing that I would say is, having myself started my career as an activist, that, you know, across these regions, there is already mobilization. So it's not, so I think one of the lessons that we learned with another project which was working on agriculture and nutrition and food security in South Asia is that we had some very interesting findings which were echoing some of the things that Maureen was saying about women's time, not having enough time to do because of, and Amina about having too much of burden, which was really affecting nutrition negatively. And this was not an issue which the women's rights and ongoing struggles of women in the region were taking on board. They were not taking on board the nutrition side of it. And through our research, actually, we just linked up with the ongoing struggles from the women's movement, from other groups, and said, okay, this is an additional agenda which you can take on board. This is an additional piece of research that can strengthen your lobbying or advocacy. And that has really taken off at the South Asia level. And I must say here that coming to Daniel's point, that actually here our main support came from the international organizations. So the UN and the donors, DFID, the Department for International Development was our funding agency, and the UN Women. And actually the national governments were not willing to listen to give equal rights to women farmers in terms of land entitlements, credit entitlements, and so on. And the international agencies really helped us bring together a network of groups across South Asia. South Asia is politically very in a turmoil. They won't talk to each other. So we had to actually have our regional meeting, one of them in Nepal, another in Bangkok, where everybody could actually physically be present. Otherwise, with India and Pakistan and all this, we can't really meet in one place. And it has really kind of taken off now over the last 1.5, 2 years, that the grassroots and the civil society groups across the region have really come together with the support of the international donors, with a commitment to actually lobby at the state level. So that's another entry point, I think, which gives a lot of hope.
And we don't have many grassroots, but we want to hear from the roots of the room, and we don't have much time. I know that we have many things that we haven't touched, but maybe we open mics from the floor. You have any major comments to any of the panelists? There's 2 mics here. Just stand up and go to the mics. Probably will be the easiest way, and align. And as people come to the table, I want you, by the end of the questions, IDRC has a mandate on research for development that's given by Parliament. I want to ask you to find one knowledge gap that we should be looking at in the next years related to the topics that we have been discussing. Not for now. We hear from the... And if you can please introduce yourself, who you are, and if you are with an organization, welcome to say so.
Okay, my name is Kaiser Iriani. I am a researcher in conflict. And my observation and question, power is about influence. And obviously, the economic power is the most important when we are trying to play with the power balance. So when we talk about this, are we doing enough? Do you think, are we, meaning the people who are working in development, are they doing enough to give women opportunity to improve their economic power? Because I think that's how we are going to make a major change and a sustainable change. And saying that, also, are we capitalizing on somehow climate change, taking it as an opportunity to give women more power? Because climate change, again, is about the loss of economic opportunity. So this is an opportunity to give women this economic opportunity and somehow transfer it from men? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We take a couple of questions in each side.
Thank you, panelists, and it's been a very illuminating evening. My name is Esther. I'm a PhD student here in the University of Ottawa. The area of my research is the impact of intellectual property rights on female entrepreneurs in developing countries. Now, I want to reiterate the fact, the importance, which you have already mentioned, of training both male or men and women, boys and girls together, because it really doesn't help, or I mean, that's what we've been doing in the past, just focusing on training women about their roles and all that. But it's important to bring boys, men, into the discussion. And so I have always advocated the need for gender education for little boys in primary school, especially at the community level. If you start that early, I think we have a longer-term success. If we bring them in at that point, that is one. Secondly, I came across a research in the course of my work about women producers of shea butter in Ghana, and the role of NGOs who have come into the situation, I mean, to improve the means of production, take them from their manual production to mechanical production of this shea butter. But it was discovered that even at that level, it is the men who had the benefits, because they were the ones being trained to be in charge of the machineries. They were the ones handling the accounts. And at the end of the day, I'm like, these things are meant to improve the lives of women, but here again, it is the men that are being more positively impacted. So I don't know if you have encountered such scenarios in the communities you have worked and how you have dealt with them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the third one there.
My name is Lisa Neveye. I work for USC Canada. And similarly, my question or comment was about knowledge. So women's knowledge, how do we make sure that while we're building skills and capacity, we don't undervalue women's knowledge that they already have? At USC Canada, we had a participatory seed security assessment that was a really good opportunity for men and women to come together and address seed saving and seed security. And at the beginning, men's were, especially in West Africa, men's were taking the lead of the participatory workshop. But throughout the training, they were kind of forced to take a step back and listen to women's knowledge, and because they have such a key role, right? So I don't know if you have other kind of tools or methodology or opportunity that you had that can kind of value women's knowledge, make sure that we visibilize, recognize, and use women's knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone want to jump? If no, I pick you. So you look like you want to answer something there.
Yeah, I can try to say something. On the first question, I think actually there's been huge amount of focus, as colleagues also here pointed out, on income generation, economic empowerment of women. And I think, again, I don't remember who exactly said it, but the question is also, how, that I think needs more addressing is, what happens? What are the implications of that? I'm not suggesting let's not do it, because of course it is very important. It is a key thing to do to improve the situation of women. So that that they're generating an income, that the income is higher, from the activities they're doing. But I think the focus there is really big. I think the focus where it is not big enough is in, okay, what are the implications of this? How does this affect the structures, and how can we make sure, for example, that a conflict is minimized, or how do we work more on social norms so that there is no backlash from the situation, and actually that all the work that they have highlighted around working also with men from the beginning. So I think that's very complementary to the point on income, and on the point of knowledge, I think it's a thin line on this capacity building. I know a lot of people really go against this term, find it inappropriate, find it a post-colonial kind of terminology and all that. And I think it's very, you really raise a key point there on what this capacity building means, and I know work that we have done, for example, in the Philippines, which is about recapturing knowledge around, just to give you a very tiny example around for example, organic composting materials, rather than using something, that is you buy from a firm and has actually even environmental negative impacts. How do you recover that knowledge which is no longer used on building organic composting and all that? So I think, yeah, I'm with you in that this has to be very carefully thought, really in combination with the people that you're working with, the communities you're working with, and it has to be very careful and cognizant of the idea that the line between post-colonial mentality and capacity building can be thin.
I want to probably address, Nidya, is climate change an opportunity for women empowerment?
I think, well, that you've put me on the spot there.
Yes, I did.
But
they thought that we have our questions prepared.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, is it an opportunity for women? I think definitely something which I think Amina said earlier, that it is pushing women into non-traditional tasks or traditionally male tasks, if you like. So in that sense, it's disrupting sort of traditional gender divisions of labor, of what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. It's quite acceptable now for women to go to the markets, for them to do things. So yes, in that sense, I think it is an opportunity. And I think, again, reiterating the point she was making and the point also I was making earlier, that in the absence of sort of support, particularly, and this links a little bit to the economic empowerment point, that of course, as he said, it is a priority. You have to survive. You need food. You need money for your basic needs and so on. What tends to give is the sort of reproductive domain of care, of nurture, of cooking, of feeding. So we find, for instance, in South Asia, that women are pushed to work, they're taking on non-traditional tasks, they're working 12 hours a day, 13 hours a day, on par in agriculture, and then there's little time available for other tasks, and there's no support. So there's no cooking gas ready all the time, there's no drinking water supply, there's no health care, there's no child care, there are no creches. And in fact, recently I was reading that the Indian government has actually cut the number of creches in India, which was not huge. It was 25,000, now it's down to 7,000 over the last 5-6 years. So what do you do actually? And I think this is where is the negative side. I think taking on more roles is good, but somewhere there has to be a work-life. I mean, we talk about work-life balance. And I think when we talk about rural women particularly, coping with climate change, I think we are not talking about work-life. Work-life balance has become a very middle-class
luxury.
thing. Yeah, luxury rather than for the poor.
Maureen, there was a question on training women and men working, and you actually have working a lot. We were talking this morning on the masculinities and the engaging traditional leaders. Can you give some examples to the question that we got in that aspect of bringing gender beyond women?
Yes, and I think we did talk about role modeling, which is the question that she had about at what point do we begin to pass these messages, and at what point, like if I was to challenge all of us, how are we living our own lives in bringing up the next generations, to recognize the gender inequalities, that there are. So as we go around implementing all these participatory approaches, there is details that we need, to take care of. The timings when we do the trainings, what else is happening at the communities, how we target women, how we target men, at which point do we bring them together, at which point do we recognize that even women themselves are not homogeneous. Yeah? They are in collectives. And when we did a collectives assessment, you find there is some that are ready to go, to engage markets, and those are the A ones. Then there's B ones. But the C and D ones even need to have that capacity on record keeping, on just holding the group together. So how do you develop needs within the community, even within segments of women? And as somebody else said, within youth. Youth is not a homogeneous population. There's female youth, there is male youth in different contexts. So I think it's really understanding the context, the specific challenges that men and women face, and living, the change ourselves, and being able to model those behaviors and ensuring that people are actually critically conscious of everything that they do.
Thank you. And I want to send you the question on the example of Ghana, because we were actually discussing briefly this morning as well. If we have found unexpected unintentional results by trying to do something in a program and suddenly not doing the gender transformation that we were expecting, but on contrary, having some negative results. I know that you have any examples, because we do all have some examples that you want to share with our colleague.
Actually, I didn't get the question very correctly. I don't know if it is the jet lag.
Then answer the question that you got. And I think that's the point is, when we do an intervention thinking that by empowering women or doing a new technology is going to change dynamics, and what happens is that suddenly men benefit more than women for that intervention. And I think that was the example, the phase. And we actually have an example this morning on you were mentioning that as soon as the new product gives money, men take over the business.
Thank you for that question, whoever asked. Indeed. It's interesting, yeah. We were just discussing, Maureen was presenting her thing, and I was sharing my own experience working in an agriculture project. The objective of the project was to economic empowerment of women. That was as a gender focal person. And we did very well. Like, we had trained women on off-season vegetable production, since the site was peri-urban area, successful. Now what happened was, the moment the scale of income increased after a threshold, so suddenly in all the meetings, it's the husbands who are coming and the wives, and we're suddenly surprised, how come that the whole dynamics has changed? They were like, yeah, now we will come to the meeting. So my wife is at home because the income has increased. So suddenly now, with more income, it's now men's role. And that was a challenge. And today I was also discussing, what we did then was, at one point, today somebody mentioned, like, when you're talking about this power, conflict is inevitable. Sometimes it happens. And we had to say that, no, we would only train the members and not members' spouse or children. We had to take a stand. And also, now, as Maureen said, the women's group themselves were very active in that, saying that, okay, on who controls the income made from the agriculture or the vegetable production. So that was quite a huge challenge. I don't think we have total solution even now, and this is where I think the need to start working on the power dynamics, wherein lies the root cause of the gender discrimination and the social norms. That is very important. Unless you touch it, often we don't do it because of the sensitivities and the conflict. But I think without doing that, focusing only on, if you give me 1 minute, can I? Let me personalize it. I'm part of South Asian culture. I'm part of that community, right? So everybody is happy. I'm working outside, earning money. But the expectation is after meeting my reproductive and household work. So the productive work is on top of that. So everybody is happy, but I'm supposed to take care of all the household work and the reproductive work. So it was, I'm an empowered woman, but it was a challenge for me to bargain, that space, that no, I'm not going to do all the household work, everything else, and also the work that I'm supposed to do, because that way I will simply collapse. That's not going to. But it was not an easy task, even for me, to bargain that, and just imagine in a rural context what that would be like. So economic empowerment is important, but equally, working on those structural power disbalances is very important. Otherwise, it's not sustainable.
Thank you. That was a minute very well used. Thank you. So with that, we have finished the panel session. So please join me on really thanking all of our panelists. And I want to invite Stephen Potter, the Director of Food Security at Global Affairs Canada, to give us some final reflections on what we have here today. Do you have a mic? Yes.
Thanks very much, Santiago. I'm just going to stand up here so I can put my little book here. So at the outset of this, you said you were very happy to have here today, researchers, practitioners, specialists. Well, I'm D, none of the above, but I do have the power to try to sum up. So you also asked your panelists to identify major challenges, but also to identify what's working. And I do have to confess, I found the major challenges column of my book a bit longer than the what's working or what can work section. So all the students and researchers in the room will be very glad to know that there's lots of work for you to do in identifying what will work to address the many challenges that were identified today. Everyone at this meeting, I think, has had an opportunity to listen to a really rich exchange of views, sharing of research findings, experiences in the field. So we're all taking away something different from this. We're looking at it through our own perspectives and our own interests. I'm going to take the I guess the liberty of giving you a bit of my perspective of what some of the main themes we heard today. Things that really resonated for me, and partly in my work funding development assistance programs and advocating in international organizations. A few things came through very clearly. I guess, first of all, it was really the three-dimensional nature of gender equality challenges, particularly in the agricultural sector. So we've got, and the necessity of looking at issues in a three-dimensional, sophisticated way. First of all, it's not just about women and girls, it's about women, girls, men, and boys, and other genders. It's multi-level in nature. So yes, absolutely, there's a need to look at dynamics in the family, individuals, but also the institutions, so the social institutions and the actual kind of physical institutions of the state at different levels or different organizations. It's also intergenerational, and that was a theme that really came through loud and clear. Not just that the dynamics that we're talking about are intergenerational, but with the introduction of climate change and other disruptive or destabilizing factors, the traditional intergenerational or generational roles are also destabilized, which is a challenge. It's many challenges, actually, but can be an opportunity if we begin to accept that disruption and destabilization, particularly by climate change, is actually the new norm. Migration is a normal thing. It's part of the development process, and so how can we work with it? How can we make the most of it? How can we, through creative research, identify those individuals or those families or those companies or those state workers who are identifying opportunities and exploiting them and finding new ways to move forward and to find new opportunities. So, I am a little disappointed. Nitya says there's no silver bullets. I actually came here looking for silver bullets, but as always, none. And as a development, guy working for a donor, silver bullets are us. So for the government of Canada, as you know, has had a feminist agenda since the beginning of the current government. It's had a feminist agenda. It's announced that Women Deliver would be happening in Canada in June 2019. Many years ago, they committed to that. They've also the Feminist International assistance policy is a major expression of that feminist agenda. And if you read some of the things that we put out, you'll see that the agenda is not really so much about prescriptions for how feminism should happen and should change the world, but it's also about sponsoring discussion, sponsoring research, sponsoring evidence, facilitating different views and confrontation of different and diverse views, and so it's very satisfying for me as someone who was involved in putting together the FIAP to participate in an event like that, which is really like this, which we really hoped to facilitate. And I think this is happening more and more. IDRC has done an excellent job of organizing events like this and sponsoring discussions across Canada and the world on key issues like gender in agriculture. So it's very gratifying. I think through discussions like this, through confronting the complexity of these challenges, we are going to identify, we're going to understand each other better. We're going to identify new ways of working and achieving results, new evidence that we can use to substantiate new ways of working. And so thank you very much, all of you, for participating in this discussion. Another round of applause for our panelists, who've been excellent. And Santiago, thanks.
Thank you. I have this one. No, thank you very much, Stephen. And we don't have a silver bullet, but we will have like a package of bullets that we can use at some point. We are done, but I want to thank a lot of people. And I want to thank first and remember that we are in International Development Week in University of Ottawa. So thank you for helping us and hosting us in such a beautiful place. I want to thank Stephen for coming and really giving us the perspective of what is real that researchers sometimes forget. I want to thank all the panelists for traveling long and being with us and sharing information. I hope that you can stay a little bit in their works, exchange a couple of business cards. I want to thank the IDRC's teams that have been involved from the agriculture, environment, communication, because this has been something that started many months ago. You can imagine that this is not easy to do. This is part of the series of conference and panels that IDRC is putting together to support our thinking for the Women Deliver conference in Vancouver in June. And actually, we have more of this coming. I was trying to look up which ones are the ones that are coming. March 8th, we are holding another one, Solutions for Gender Equality, with a theme from public to digital, solutions to address gender-based violence. So that's going to be in IDRC's building in 150 Kent. Keep looking at our website, keep following our Twitter. We are trying to have more of these discussions. They cannot happen if you don't come. We keep talking to each other if not. So please engage with us. We are here with a real mandate of developing knowledge and sharing that knowledge as much as possible and learning from what you have. So thank you, everybody.